As you watch the first half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
Why did the British need to tax the colonies?
What were the effects of Samuel Adams calling the event in Boston a massacre?
The American colonies had grown used to being governed from across the Atlantic Ocean, but Britain's grip wasn't loosening. British taxes and soldiers were a constant reminder that the king was still in control. Colonists were angry and they were ready to act.
What do you know about the leaders of the American Revolution and their beliefs?
Madison, Hamilton, Monroe.
John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin.
George Washington was the leader of the army. They were fighting against taxes from Britain, especially unfair ones that they thought they shouldn't have to pay because they weren't represented.
The leaders of the American Revolution based their philosophy on John Locke, who said that the government exists purely to work for the needs of the people.
And so it was a real way for them to say, this is what we believe in and we want our freedom and we're going to do what it takes to get it.
After 1500, many European nations were competing for land in North America. The French and British already controlled vast territories, but both nations were interested in owning even more. With help from the Iroquois, British troops and colonists defeated the French in the French and Indian War. Colonists were grateful to the British government for sending soldiers, but they wanted to remain as free as possible of control by the mother country. For that reason, the end of the war brought new friction between the colonists and Britain. First, Britain's King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763. In it, the king forbade colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British wanted to prevent the colonists from taking more land from Native Americans because they feared it would lead to more expensive wars. And the British decided that the colonists should help pay the cost of the soldiers they would station in America, soldiers who protected the colonists from Native American attacks. In 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act, which placed a tax on all printed material, from newspapers to playing cards. Calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, many colonists took to the streets to protest the new taxes. Eventually, the colonists' actions forced Britain to repeal the Stamp Act, but the British put new taxes in place. Each time the British passed a new tax, the colonists became angry. Colonists staged boycotts of British goods, and they wrote pamphlets that criticized Parliament's policies. Tensions rose even more when the British sent troops to restore order. Anger would soon turn to violence in Boston. On March 5, 1770, an angry group of colonists surrounded a small group of British soldiers. They threw snowballs and rocks. The frightened soldiers opened fire, killing 5 colonists and wounding 6. This event came to be called the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, the British passed the Tea Act, which aimed to help a British tea company. Again, the colonists boycotted. And on the night of December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty took a further step. A group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded an English ship that was docked in Boston. Then they dumped 342 cases of tea into the harbor. The king was furious with the colonists, and Parliament passed a set of laws called the Coercive Acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts because they were so severe. The Intolerable Acts closed Boston's port, reduced the power of town meetings, and increased the authority of British royal officials. The king had hoped the colonists would give in to his power. Instead, they continued to resist. Delegates from many colonies met in the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774. They demanded that Britain remove the Intolerable Acts, but the British refused. The next spring, the British sent troops to the town of Concord to seize a supply of weapons. On the way to Concord, the British soldiers met 70 militiamen in the town of Lexington. A shot was fired, the first shot of the American Revolution. More shots rang out, and 8 colonists died. The British continued to Concord, but met more militia and more fighting. They were forced to retreat. Militia troops from nearby towns fired on the British during the long retreat to Boston, killing and wounding many soldiers. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to discuss what to do. Some delegates wanted to remain loyal to Britain, others wanted independence, and others were undecided. But most knew war was on the horizon. Meanwhile, British troops and militiamen faced each other again in a battle at Bunker Hill near Boston. For a while, the colonists held off their enemy, but the British took the hill on their third try. The militia lost the battle, but proved that they could stand up to the well-trained British army. This confidence would help spur a war for independence. Did you know there were 2 Boston Tea Parties? After the success of the first one, Bostonians held a second one on March 7, 1774. The loss of tea cost the British government the equivalent of $3 million in today's currency.
Colonists were angered by the presence of British soldiers in the colonies, especially in Boston. One fateful night, a group of redcoats would be tested by an irate mob of colonists. No one knows exactly what started the confrontation, but the outcome is certain. Samuel Adams took control and made sure colonists knew that blood had been spilled.
What are the qualities of a good leader?
Loving but firm.
They have to have confidence.
Somebody who also is just very strong emotionally.
Daring, compassionate.
Bold, gracious, noble.
They should be fair and honest, and they should do the right thing.
Smart, dependable.
Wise.
Always do the right
He
thing.
knows what's good for the people.
And make decisions based on that.
In the middle of the 1700s, Great Britain had 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America. The colonists who lived there enjoyed what seemed like an unlimited supply of cheap land. They were proud to be a part of Britain, and proud of the rights they enjoyed as British subjects. But trouble began in 1763, when the British government banned the colonists from settling farther west. Overnight, the colonists were denied precious new land, and with it, opportunity. Many ignored the proclamation and continued to settle in those forbidden lands. But they could not ignore the next action the British took, the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act required that every piece of paper sold in the colonies, from pamphlets to playing cards, have a revenue stamp. The colonists complained that the British had never imposed such a tax on Americans before. Angry colonists boycotted British goods. Some even rioted in protest. As the riots and boycotts continued, the British were forced to give in. Less than a year after the Stamp Act came into effect, the British Parliament repealed the tax law. But Parliament soon approved other duties and taxes, and tensions mounted in the colonies. Britain sent troops to Boston to maintain order and enforce its taxes. On March 5, 1770, an angry mob in Boston gathered around 9 British soldiers, or redcoats. The crowd began to taunt them and threaten them with wooden clubs and sticks. When their shouts did not provoke the soldiers, the crowd threw ice at them, and some in the crowd even yelled "Fire!" When a colonist named Richard Palm struck a soldier with a club, a shot finally rang out. Other shots quickly followed. Some witnesses later claimed that Captain Thomas Preston, the commander of the British troops, ordered his soldiers to fire. Others said the soldiers fired their weapons on their own. The soldiers themselves said their shooting was in self-defense. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the anti-British protests, saw an opportunity in this tragedy. He and his allies began calling the incident the Boston Massacre. They helped rouse further anger against the British with articles and pictures that described British soldiers shooting at unarmed civilians. The British tried to calm the colonists by bringing the soldiers to trial. In the end, juries made up of colonists ruled that Preston and most of his men had fired in self-defense. Only 2 of Preston's soldiers were convicted, but they were only found guilty of manslaughter. The trials helped calm American anger. Parliament also tried to appease the colonies by repealing all the duties it had enacted, except one. England would not overturn the tax on tea. Within a few years, this tax added to the colonists' growing resentment toward the British, and conflict erupted again. First along the docks of Boston, and then across the colonies.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
Why did the British need to tax the colonies?
What were the effects of Samuel Adams calling the event in Boston a massacre?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.